picture a sunlit regatta in the quaint coastal village of Plymouth, where gleaming yachts race for glory and a silver cup. But when a sailor is found drowned, his neck marked by a struggle, the race turns deadly. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose quiet knitting hides a mind unravelling secrets. Was it the stern captain, hiding a grudge? The nervous crewman, guarding a guilty secret? The ambitious rival, desperate for victory? Or the watchful spectator, seeing more than she admits? As clues wash ashore, a torn sailcloth, a rusted buckle, the truth lies hidden in the tide. Can Miss Marple catch a killer before the sea swallows the evidence? Chapter 1. The race begins. The morning sun cast a golden sheen across St. Mary's Bay, its gentle waves lapping against the weathered pilings of Plymouth's harbour. The village, nestled along the rugged Devon coast, hummed with anticipation for the annual regatta, a tradition as old as the salt-stained cottages lining the shore. Sails fluttered in the brisk breeze, and the air carried the mingled scents of seaweed and freshly brewed tea from the nearby tea-room. Miss Jane Marple, on a rare visit to her nephew Raymond West, sat primly on a wicker chair near the quay, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm as steady as the tide. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, surveyed the scene with quiet curiosity, missing nothing. The harbour was a kaleidoscope of activity. Fishermen mended nets, their calloused hands deft, while children darted between stalls selling hot pies and ribbons. The yachts, sleek and proud, bobbed at their moorings, their crews bustling with last-minute preparations. The Sea Sprite, a graceful vessel with a hull of polished oak, was the talk of the village. Its captain, Richard Hargrove, a man whose weathered face told of decades at sea, stood on deck, barking orders with a voice that carried over the gulls' cries. His crew member, young Tommy Blake, scrambled about, his cheeks flushed as he checked the rigging, his movements betraying a nervous energy that Miss Marple noted with interest. Across the harbour, the wind chaser, rival to the Sea Sprite, gleamed under the sun, its brass fittings catching the light like winking stars. Victor Crane, its captain, leaned against the mast, his posture relaxed yet calculated, his eyes scanning the crowd with a confidence that bordered on swagger. Miss Marple observed him, her needles pausing briefly. There was something in his gaze, a hunger perhaps, that reminded her of a young man she'd once known in St. Mary Mead, who'd been too eager to prove himself. Among the spectators thronging the quay, one figure stood apart. Clara Henshaw, a woman of indeterminate age with a severe bun and a navy shawl, clutched a pair of binoculars, her attention fixed on the Sea Sprite. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her. The binoculars were expensive, the kind used by birdwatchers or those with more particular interests. Clara's hands trembled slightly, and her lips were pressed into a thin line, as if guarding a secret. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind filing away this small detail, much as she tucked a spare skein of wool into her bag. Raymond West, ever the enthusiastic host, joined his aunt, his face alight with the day's excitement. "Quite the spectacle, isn't it, Aunt Jane?" he said, gesturing to the yachts. "Hargrove's tipped to win again. The man's a legend." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking once more. "Legends, Raymond, are often built on fragile foundations," she replied, her tone mild but her eyes keen. She asked about the competitors, learning that the regatta's silver cup was more than a trophy. It was a symbol of supremacy in Plymouth, a prize that stirred rivalries as deep as the bay itself. As the starting gun's echo rolled across the water, the yacht surged forward, their sails billowing like the wings of great white birds. The crowd roared, hats waving, but Miss Marple's attention wavered. A prickle of unease stirred within her, as faint as the whisper of a dropped stitch. The sea sprite led, its prow cutting cleanly through the waves, yet something in the scene felt off-kilter. Was it the way Tommy Blake had glanced at Hargrove, a flicker of resentment in his eyes? Or Victor Crane's too casual stance, as if he knew something the others did not? Perhaps it was Clara Henshaw, who lowered her binoculars abruptly, her face pale as she turned away. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft clack of her needles a counterpoint to the crowd's cheers. She said nothing, but her mind was already at work, sifting through the morning's impressions like threads in a tapestry. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that even the brightest days could hide shadows, and Lymouth, she suspected, was no different. Chapter 2. The tragedy unfolds. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary's Bay, its rays splintering across the waves like shards of glass. The regatta was in full swing, the yachts slicing through the water with a grace that belied the fierce competition beneath their billowing sails. From her vantage point on the quay, Miss Jane Marple watched the race unfold, her knitting needles idle for the moment as she absorbed the scene. The crowd's cheers rose and fell, a rhythmic pulse that matched the ebb and flow of the tide. The sea sprite, captained by the indomitable Richard Hargrove, held a commanding lead, its sails taut and its hull skimming the surface with practiced ease. Behind it, the wind chaser, under Victor Crane's deft command, trailed but not by much, its sleek form cutting a determined path through the swells. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever behind her spectacles, darted between the yachts and the spectators. Raymond West, her nephew, stood beside her, his enthusiasm undimmed by the salt-laden breeze that tugged at his hat. "Hargrove's got this in the bag," he declared, pointing to the sea sprite as it rounded a buoy with precision. "He's won 3 years running, you know." Miss Marple nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile, but her attention lingered on the figures aboard the yachts. Tommy Blake, the young crew member on the Sea Sprite, was a blur of motion, adjusting ropes with a fervour that seemed almost desperate. On the wind chaser, Victor Crane stood at the helm, his posture erect, his eyes fixed on the leading yacht, with an intensity that Miss Marple found noteworthy. Among the crowd, Clara Henshaw remained a solitary figure, her binoculars raised once more. Miss Marple noted the way her hands gripped the instrument, knuckles white, as if she were searching for something specific, rather than merely watching the race. The other spectators, locals in tweed caps, holiday-makers in bright scarves, and children clutching sticky buns, cheered indiscriminately, their voices mingling with the cries of gulls overhead. Yet Miss Marple's unease from earlier persisted, a faint thread of disquiet weaving through her thoughts. She had learned, in her many years in St. Mary Mead, that crowds often masked secrets, and this one, she suspected, was no exception. The race progressed, the yachts weaving through the course, marked by buoys bobbing like sentinels in the bay. The Sea Sprite maintained its lead, but the wind chaser was gaining, its sails angled to catch every gust. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the horizon, where a rocky outcrop jutted from the sea, its jagged edges softened by seaweed and the tide's caress. It was a lonely spot, far from the spectator's view, and she made a mental note of its position relative to the race's path. Something about it tugged at her memory, though she could not yet say why. Then, abruptly, the mood shifted. A cry pierced the air, not the jubilant shout of a spectator, but a sharp, urgent call from one of the smaller boats patrolling the course. "Man overboard!" The words cut through the crowd's chatter like a knife. Faces turned, voices hushed, and a ripple of alarm spread along the quay. Miss Marple's needles stilled completely, her eyes narrowing as she followed the pointing arms toward the water. A figure bobbed in the distance, unnaturally still, far from the sea sprite's course. The patrol boat sped toward it, its engine roaring, and the crowd held its collective breath. Raymond, his face pale, grabbed his aunt's arm. "Good heavens, Aunt Jane, what's happened?" Miss Marple did not reply immediately, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding. The patrol boat reached the figure, and two men hauled a limp form aboard. Whispers spread like wildfire. "It's one of Hargrove's crew! He's not moving!" The race came to an abrupt halt, the yachts slowing as their crews craned to see. The sea sprite turned sharply, its sails slackening, while the wind chaser lingered at a distance, its captain motionless at the helm. The patrol boat returned to the harbour, its grim cargo covered by a tarpaulin. Constables pushed through the crowd, their faces stern, and a makeshift barrier was erected near the jetty. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, was summoned, his black bag swinging as he hurried to the scene. Miss Marple, rising from her chair, moved closer, her small figure unassuming yet purposeful. Raymond followed, his earlier excitement replaced by a grim curiosity. "Stay back, please," a constable barked, but Miss Marple's quiet demeanour and Raymond's connection to the local magistrate granted her a vantage point near the jetty's edge. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his fingers probing with professional detachment. The crowd strained to see, but Miss Marple needed no closer view to recognize the man. Edward Lyle, the quiet sailor from the Sea Sprite, whose reserved manner had caught her eye earlier. His face was pale, his dark hair plastered to his skull, and his clothes clung sodden to his frame. Dr. Haydock's expression grew grave as he examined the neck, his fingers lingering on faint marks that Miss Marple, even from a distance, could see were not the work of the sea alone. "Drowned," Dr. Haydock announced, rising to confer with the head constable, Inspector Crane. "But these marks suggest he didn't go quietly." The word murder was not spoken, but it hung in the air, heavy as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The crowd murmured, some retreating in shock, others pressing closer for details. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind already turning over the implications. "Drowning in a race," she murmured to Raymond, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. "How very singular." Inspector Crane, a tall man with a methodical air, took charge, directing his men to secure the area. He was unrelated to Victor Crane, Miss Marple learned from Raymond, though the coincidence of names piqued her interest. The inspector's sharp eyes scanned the crowd, settling briefly on the figures now disembarking from the yachts. Richard Hargrove strode ashore, his face a mask of disbelief. "Edward was a strong swimmer," he said to the inspector, his voice rough with emotion. "He'd never fall overboard, not in a race like this." Tommy Blake followed, his hands twisting together, his eyes wide with something that might have been fear or guilt. Victor Crane, stepping off the wind chaser, offered a sombre nod, his earlier confidence subdued but not entirely gone. Clara Henshaw, still clutching her binoculars, stood frozen at the crowd's edge, her face a study in distress. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind cataloguing their reactions. Hargrove's gruff certainty, Tommy's nervous fidgeting, Victor's measured regret, and Clara's silent intensity. Each was a thread in a pattern she could not yet fully discern. She noted, too, the position of Edward's body when found, far from the sea sprite's path, closer to the rocky outcrop she had observed earlier. The sure current she knew from her walks along the coast was strong in that part of the bay, capable of carrying a body some distance. But why had Edward been there at all? The sea sprite had not veered near the outcrop, according to the race's charted course. Raymond, sensing his aunt's preoccupation, leaned closer. "You're thinking something, Aunt Jane." I can tell Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she only patted his arm. "I am thinking, Raymond, that people are rarely what they seem, even in a place as charming as Lymouth." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking with a calm that belied the storm brewing in her mind. The regatta, meant to be a celebration of skill and sport, had taken a dark turn, and Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface of this tragedy lay motives as tangled as the ropes on the yachts. The inspector called for the key figures to gather at the Lymouth Inn that evening, where statements would be taken. Miss Marple, invited through Raymond's connection to the magistrate, resolved to attend, her curiosity now fully engaged. She thought of Edward Lyle, a man who had seemed unremarkable, yet had met an extraordinary end. What had drawn him to the water's edge? Had he fallen, or had he been pushed? And if the latter, who among these sailors and spectators had reason to silence him? As the crowd dispersed, some to gossip in the tea-room, others to their homes, Miss Marple lingered by the quay, her eyes on the rocky outcrop now shrouded in the gathering dusk. The sea, she knew, kept its secrets well, but human nature was less guarded. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled many a mystery by observing the small things, the glance, the gesture, the word unspoken. Here in Lymouth, she sensed, the truth lay not in the waves, but in the hearts of those who sailed upon them. She turned to Raymond, her voice gentle but firm. "Come, my dear, we mustn't be late for the inspector's meeting. There is much to learn, and I suspect the answers are closer than we think." With that, she tucked her knitting into her bag and set off toward the inn, her small figure a beacon of quiet determination in the fading light. Chapter 3. The Suspects Emerge. The Lymouth Inn, with its low-beamed ceiling and walls adorned with nautical relics, buzzed with a subdued tension as the evening settled over the village. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows, lending an air of solemnity to the gathering summoned by Inspector Crane. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner near a window overlooking the darkened harbour, observed the room with her characteristic quiet attentiveness. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needles still for now, as her eyes moved from face to face, gathering impressions as deftly as she gathered stitches. Inspector Crane stood at the centre of the room, his notebook open, his manner brisk yet measured. He was a man of precision, his moustache neatly trimmed, his uniform crisp despite the day's turmoil. Around him, the key figures in the tragedy of Edward Lyle's death had assembled. Captain Richard Hargrove, Tommy Blake, Victor Crane, and Clara Henshaw. Raymond West, at Miss Marple's side, whispered introductions, his voice low to avoid drawing attention. The magistrate, a portly man named Mr. Petwick, had invited Miss Marple to attend, citing her reputation for insight, though she suspected Raymond's enthusiasm had played a part. Hargrove, broad-shouldered and weathered, stood with arms crossed, his jaw set as if defying the room's scrutiny. Edward was no fool, he said, his voice gravelly with conviction. He knew the sea sprite like his own hand. Falling overboard? Nonsense! He swam like a fish. Inspector Crane nodded, jotting a note, but his eyes flickered to Tommy Blake, who sat hunched in a chair, his fingers picking at the frayed cuff of his jacket. The young crew member's face was pale, his eyes darting to the door as if longing to flee. Miss Marple noted the sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the cool evening air seeping through the window. Victor Crane, by contrast, exuded calm. He leaned against a wall, one hand in his pocket, his tailored jacket immaculate. A terrible loss, he said, his tone smooth, almost rehearsed. But the sea can be unforgiving, Inspector. Even the best sailors make mistakes. His eyes met Hargrove's briefly, a flash of something, challenge, perhaps, passing between them. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Victor's polished shoes, their shine incongruous with the day's events. A man so composed, she thought, might be hiding more than grief. Clara Henshaw sat apart, her binoculars resting on the table before her like a guilty secret. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap betrayed a tremor, and her eyes avoided the inspector's probing gaze. When asked what she had seen, she murmured, "Nothing unusual." "I was watching the race, that's all." Her voice was soft, but Miss Marple detected a strain, as if each word were carefully chosen. The binoculars, she noted, were still focused, their lenses pointed toward the table's edge, as if Clara had been studying something or someone intently. Inspector Crane's questions were thorough, if not inspired. He pressed Hargrove on the sea sprite's movements, learning that Edward had been tasked with adjusting the jib during the race's critical leg. "He was forward, alone," Hargrove admitted, his brow furrowing. "But the deck was steady, the sea calm." "I can't explain it, Tommy." When questioned, stammered that he'd been aft, securing a line, and hadn't seen Edward fall. Victor confirmed his wind chaser had been trailing the sea sprite, too far to witness anything amiss. Clara repeated her claim of seeing nothing, though her fingers tightened around her shawl. Miss Marple listened, her mind sifting through the words like sand through a sieve. She recalled the rocky outcrop from the morning, its isolation a stark contrast to the crowded quay. Edward's body, found far from the sea sprite's course, suggested more than a simple fall. The marks on his neck, as Dr. Haydock had noted, hinted at a struggle. Someone, she reasoned, had ensured Edward did not resurface. But who? And why? As the meeting adjourned, the suspects dispersed, their footsteps echoing on the inn's wooden floor. Hargrove muttered about checking the sea sprite. Tommy slipped out with a furtive glance. Victor offered a polite nod to the inspector, and Clara clutched her binoculars and hurried into the night. Miss Marple remained, her eyes on the fire's dying embers. Raymond, eager for her thoughts, leaned closer. "Well, Aunt Jane, what do you make of it?" She smiled, her expression serene, but her mind light. "People, Raymond, are like books. The covers may be plain, but the pages hold surprises." She tapped her knitting bag thoughtfully. "Captain Hargrove is certain Edward didn't fall. yet he offers no alternative. Tommy is nervous, as young men often are when they've something to hide, though it may not be murder. Mr. Crane's composure is admirable, but composure can mask calculation. And Miss Henshaw, her binoculars see more than she admits, I think. Raymond frowned. You think one of them did it? Miss Marple's needles clicked once. A single stitch formed. I think, my dear, that Edward Lyle's death was no accident. And in a village like Lymouth, where everyone knows everyone's business, secrets have a way of surfacing, like driftwood on the tide. She rose, her small figure unassuming yet purposeful, and suggested they return to Raymond's cottage. As they stepped into the cool night, the harbour lay quiet, the yachts mere silhouettes against the moonlit water. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from quiet. She thought of Edward Lyle, a man whose quiet presence had masked a story now ended in violence. The suspects, each with their own burdens, were pieces in a puzzle she was determined to solve. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that motives often lay in the smallest details. A glance, a hesitation, a lie told too smoothly. Here, in Lymouth, she would find those details, and with them, the truth. Chapter 4. The Captain's Tale. The morning following the grim gathering at the Lymouth Inn dawned with a mist that clung to the village like a shroud, softening the outlines of the harbour and muffling the cries of the gulls. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, set out early, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobbled path to Captain Richard Hargrove's cottage. It was a modest dwelling, perched on a rise overlooking St. Mary's Bay, its whitewashed walls weathered by salt and time. A brass ship's bell hung by the door, glinting dully in the muted light. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over one arm, knocked gently, her demeanour as unassuming as the sparrows flitting in the hedgerow. Hargrove opened the door himself, his broad frame filling the threshold. His face, lined and tanned like old leather, bore the strain of the previous day, but his eyes softened at the sight of the elderly lady. "Miss Marple," he said gruffly, stepping aside. "Raymond said you might call. Come in, then." The interior was sparse but tidy, with a sextant on the mantel and charts pinned to the walls, their edges curling like autumn leaves. A kettle whistled on the stove, and Hargrove gestured to a chair by a small table, offering tea with a brusqueness that masked a weary hospitality. Miss Marple settled herself, her needles emerging almost at once, their rhythmic clicking a soothing counterpoint to the tension in the room. "I shan't keep you long, Captain," she said, her voice gentle but her eyes keen. "I only wish to understand a little more about poor Mr. Lyle. Such a tragedy, and so unexpected." Hargrove poured the tea, his large hands steady despite the faint tremor she noted in his fingers. "Unexpected," he echoed, setting a chipped mug before her. "It's unthinkable." Edward was no green lad. He'd sailed with me 5 years, knew the sea sprite better than I know my own shadow. She sipped her tea, noting its bitter strength, and steered the conversation with the deftness of a helmsman. "He was reliable, then? No troubles aboard?" Hargrove hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window, where the mist veiled the harbour. "Reliable, aye, but he'd been restless lately. Wanted a bigger share of the prize money this year. Said he'd earned it, what with the extra hours he put in on the yacht's upkeep." His tone hardened. "I told him we'd split it fair, same as always, but he wasn't satisfied." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment. "A disagreement, then?" she asked, her tone mild as milk. Hargrove's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Nothing serious, just talk." Edward wasn't one to push, but he'd been moody, keeping to himself more than usual. She filed this away, her mind turning to the nature of disputes. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how money, even in small amounts, could fray tempers like worn rope. She shifted tack, asking about the race itself. The sea sprite veered near a rocky outcrop, I understand. An unusual maneuver, perhaps? Hargrove's eyes narrowed, but he answered readily enough. "Aye, we did, briefly. A gust caught us wrong, and Edward was checking the jib to correct our course. He was alone at the bow, as I was at the helm, and Tommy was aft." His voice faltered. Next I knew, he was gone. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her thoughts sharp. The rocky outcrop again, its isolation nagged at her, a detail that refused to settle neatly. "And no one else was near him?" she pressed gently. Hargrove shook his head. "Not a soul." The wind chaser was behind us, too far to matter. Yet his certainty, she noted, carried a trace of defensiveness, as if he sensed the question's deeper intent. As she rose to leave, thanking him for the tea, her eyes caught a small object on a shelf. A brass compass, its needle still, its case engraved with the initials E.L. Edwards, she asked lightly. Hargrove's face clouded. "Aye, he left it in the cabin last week. I meant to return it." Miss Marple smiled, saying nothing, but her mind noted the compass's presence, a relic of a man now lost to the sea. Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the harbour's outlines once more. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward Raymond's cottage, her thoughts as tangled as the nets drying on the quay. Hargrove's account was straightforward, yet it raised questions. A dispute over money, however minor, could smoulder beneath the surface. His insistence on Edward's skill as a swimmer echoed her own suspicions. Drowning seemed unlikely without interference. And the outcrop, that lonely spur of rock, loomed in her mind as more than a landmark. Had Edward been drawn there, or sent? She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's quarrel over wages had led to darker deeds. People she knew could be pushed to extremes by small grievances, especially when pride or prestige was at stake. Hargrove's pride in the sea sprite was evident, but so was his tension when speaking of Edward's demands. Was it possible, she wondered, that the captain had acted to protect his authority? Or was there another hand at work, steering events toward tragedy? Miss Marple paused by the harbour, her eyes on the sea sprite, its sails furled now, its deck silent. The yacht seemed almost mournful, as if it, too, grieved for Edward Lyle. She tightened her grip on her knitting bag, resolving to speak next with Tommy Blake. The young man's nervousness at the inn had not escaped her, and she suspected he held a piece of the puzzle, whether he knew it or not. In Lymouth, as in St. Mary Mead, the truth often lay in the shadows of what was left unsaid, and Miss Marple was determined to bring it into the light. Chapter 5. The Crew Member's Secret. The afternoon sun broke through the morning's mist, casting a pale glow over Lymouth's harbour, where the sea sprite lay at anchor, its deck gleaming with a fresh coat of polish. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the lingering dampness in the air, made her way along the quay, her steps measured, and her knitting bag tucked securely under her arm. She had resolved to seek out Tommy Blake, the young crew member whose nervous demeanour at the Lymouth Inn had piqued her curiosity. There was something about the boy, his bitten nails, his darting glances, that reminded her of a lad in St. Mary Mead who had once hidden a theft behind a mask of jittery innocence. She found Tommy aboard the Sea Sprite, his hands busy with a polishing cloth as he worked on the brass fittings of the railing. The yacht rocked gently, its ropes creaking in the breeze, and Tommy's movements were almost feverish, as if he sought to erase the tragedy through sheer effort. Miss Marple paused at the gangway, her small figure unthreatening, her smile as warm as a vicarage tea. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blake," she called softly. "Might I have a word?" "I do so admire a well-kept yacht," Tommy started, nearly dropping his cloth, but he recovered quickly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "didn't expect visitors." Sure, come aboard." He scrambled to help her, though Miss Marple ascended with surprising agility for her years, her eyes already scanning the deck. The Sea Sprite was immaculate, its ropes coiled neatly, its sails furled with precision. Yet she noted a faint scuff on the deck near the bow, where Edward Lyle had last been seen, a mark that seemed fresher than the rest. Settling on a bench near the mast, Miss Marple drew out her knitting, the needles clicking with a rhythm that seemed to put Tommy at ease. "You must be proud to sail on such a fine vessel," she began, her tone conversational. "Captain Hargrove speaks highly of his crew." Tommy flushed, his hands fidgeting. "Aye, it's a good ship. Been with the captain 2 seasons now." His eyes flicked to the harbour, as if checking for eavesdroppers, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it away. She steered the conversation to the race, asking about the Sea Sprite's manoeuvres. "It must be quite a task, keeping everything in order during such a contest," she said, her needles never faltering. Tommy nodded, relaxing slightly. "It's busy, ma'am. Sails, ropes, wind. Got to be quick. Edward, he was always on the jib, steady as you like." His voice caught on Edward's name, and Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "Poor Mr. Lyle," she said softly. "Such a shock, his loss. You were fond of him, I expect." Tommy's hands stilled, and he looked down, his fingers twisting the polishing cloth. He was quiet. Kept to himself mostly. Good sailor, though. The hesitation in his voice was slight, but to Miss Marple it was as telling as a dropped stitch. She pressed delicately, her tone as light as the sea breeze. "I suppose you all got along well. No little tiffs as young men sometimes have." Tommy's face reddened, and he glanced at the scuff on the deck, as if it held answers he dared not speak. "We got on fine," he mumbled, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to the side. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, and she smiled, her voice softer still. "Young men can be careless sometimes. A bottle of spirits perhaps sneaked aboard. It's no great crime, but it can cause trouble." It was a guess, born of her memory of a saint. Mary Mead lad caught with a flask, but it struck home. Tommy's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "How'd you— I mean, it wasn't nothing serious." He caught himself, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Edward caught me with a bit of rum a few weeks back. Said he'd tell the captain if I didn't stop. Hargrove's strict about that. No drink on the Sea Sprite." His hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the strength in them, the kind that could tie a knot, or perhaps do more. "Did he tell?" she asked, her tone as mild as if discussing the weather. Tommy shook his head, his voice barely audible. "No, but he might have. I didn't hurt him, ma'am. I swear it. I was aft when he— when it happened. His desperation was palpable, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of understanding, though her mind was racing. Rum, a small secret, but enough to breed resentment, especially if Edward had held it over him. Yet Tommy's fear seemed genuine, less the mark of a murderer than of a boy caught in a web of guilt. She shifted the conversation to the race's details, asking about the rocky outcrop she had noted. Was the sea sprite near it when Edward fell? Tommy frowned, thinking, not really. We veered a bit, like the captain said, but not close. Edward was at the bow, checking the jib. I didn't see nothing till the patrol boat shouted his account matched Hargrove's, but Miss Marple noted a slight discrepancy. The veer, he said, was brief, yet Hargrove had implied it was significant. A small thing, perhaps, but in her experience, small things often led to larger truths. As she prepared to leave, thanking Tommy for his time, her eyes lingered on the scuff near the bow. A pity about this mark, she said lightly, pointing to it. It spoils such a fine deck. Tommy flushed again, muttering about a dropped tool, but his unease was evident. Miss Marple smiled, stepping carefully down the gangway, her mind turning over the morning's revelations. Tommy's secret, though minor, gave him a motive to silence Edward, and his strong hands could have managed it. Yet his fear seemed more that of a cornered youth than a calculated killer. The scuff, too, intrigued her. Fresh, out of place, perhaps a trace of a struggle. As she walked back to Raymond's cottage, the harbour bustling around her, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the rocky outcrop. Its isolation, its distance from the sea sprite's course, suggested Edward's death was no simple accident. Someone had ensured he reached that spot, and Tommy's account, while plausible, left gaps. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unravelled a theft by noting a boy's reluctance to meet her eyes. Here, Tommy's nervousness was a similar clue, though whether it pointed to murder or merely mischief, she could not yet say. She resolved to speak next with Victor Crane, whose polished demeanour and ambitious nature had caught her attention. The wind chaser's proximity to the sea sprite during the race, and Victor's cool confidence at the inn, suggested a man who planned his moves with care. Miss Marple tightened her grip on her knitting bag, her needles itching to resume their work. The truth, she knew, was like a knot. Pull the right thread, and it would unravel. And in Lymouth, as in St. Mary Mead, she was determined to find that thread. Chapter 6. The rival's ambition. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Lymouth, casting long shadows across the harbour where the yachts lay silent, their sails furled like folded wings. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm, made her way to the Lymouth Yacht Club, a squat building with salt-faded shutters and a sign creaking in the breeze. She had decided to seek out Victor Crane, the captain of the wind chaser, whose polished demeanour and sharp-eyed ambition had lingered in her mind since the meeting at the inn. There was something about him, his ease, his calculated charm, that reminded her of a young solicitor in St. Mary Mead, who had once masked deceit behind a winning smile. The yacht club was abuzz with locals and visitors, their voices mingling with the clink of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. Victor stood at the centre of a small knot of admirers, his tailored jacket and confident posture marking him as a man accustomed to attention. He was recounting a tale of a past regatta, his hands gesturing with the precision of a conductor, and the group, hung on his words. Miss Marple approached quietly, her small figure slipping through the crowd unnoticed until she stood at the edge of his circle. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might I have a moment? I'm so very interested in your beautiful yacht." Victor turned, his smile immediate and disarming. "Miss Marple, isn't it? A pleasure. The wind chaser is my pride. Would you like a closer look?" His offer was gracious, but Miss Marple caught the brief flicker in his eyes, as if he were sizing her up. She declined the tour with a gentle wave, suggesting instead a chat over tea at a nearby table. Victor agreed, extricating himself from his admirers with an ease that spoke of practice. And soon they were seated, a pot of tea between them, the harbour glinting through the club's wide windows. Miss Marple's needles emerged, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the hum of the room. "The Wind Chaser is a fine name," she began, her tone conversational. "It suits a man with ambition, I think." Victor's smile widened, but it did not quite reach his eyes. "You're perceptive, Miss Marple. I've always believed in aiming high. The regatta's a chance to prove what I'm capable of." She nodded, sipping her tea, and asked about his rivalry with Captain Hargrove. 3 years running, I hear. The Sea Sprite has taken the cup. That must be frustrating." Victor's expression tightened, though his voice remained smooth. "Hargrove's a skilled sailor, but no one wins forever. The Wind Chaser was built to outpace the Sea Sprite, and this year I meant to prove it." His words were measured, but Miss Marple detected a current of resentment beneath them, like a riptide hidden under calm waters. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead shopkeeper, who had spoken with similar restraint about a rival, only to later sabotage their wares. Ambition, she knew, could twist even the steadiest hearts. She steered the conversation to the race itself, asking about the Wind Chaser's position relative to the Sea Sprite. "You were close behind, I understand, when poor Mr. Lyle met his end?" Victor nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "Close, but not too close. We were trailing by a length or two, focused on catching the wind. I didn't see Edward fall. None of us did." His tone was regretful, but Miss Marple noted the precision of his words as if rehearsed. She mentioned the rocky outcrop, watching his face closely. "A lonely spot, that outcrop. Did your course take you near it?" Victor's hand paused just for a moment before he shrugged. "Not particularly. We followed the buoys, same as everyone. The outcrop's off the main route, dangerous really with the current." His answer was plausible, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the slight tightening of his jaw, a telltale sign of discomfort. She smiled, her needles clicking steadily, and shifted to Edward Lyle himself. "Did you know him well?" "He seemed a quiet sort, from what I hear. Quiet, yes," Victor said, leaning back. "Didn't mix much with other crews." "Good sailor, though. Hargrove relied on him." His tone was neutral, but Miss Marple sensed a dismissal, as if Edward had been beneath his notice. She pressed gently, asking if there had been any tensions between the crews. "Rivalries can be fierce, I imagine," she said, her voice as mild as the tea she sipped. Victor chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "Rivalries are part of the game, Miss Marple, but nothing serious. Just sailors wanting to win." Yet his words did not ring entirely true. Miss Marple recalled a snippet from the Quay, a local mentioning Victor's frustration at losing to Hargrove year after year. "Another loss would have ruined my reputation. he had reportedly said at the club a week before the race. She tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. A reputation is a delicate thing, isn't it? Losing again must have weighed heavily. Victor's smile faltered, and for a moment his eyes were hard, like polished steel. It stings, I'll admit, he said, recovering quickly, but I'd never let it get personal. Miss Marple nodded, her needles never faltering, but her mind was alight with possibilities. Victor's ambition was palpable, his need to best Hargrove almost a physical force. Had Edward Lyle, quiet and unassuming, somehow threatened that ambition? She thought of the wind chaser's proximity to the sea sprite during the race, a detail the police had not pursued. A skilled sailor like Victor could have manoeuvred close, perhaps under cover of a gust or a shift in the course. The rocky outcrop too loomed in her thoughts, its isolation perfect for an act unseen by the shore. As they finished their tea, Victor rose, his charm returning like a well-worn coat. I hope I've satisfied your curiosity, Miss Marple. The wind chaser's open for a tour any time. She thanked him, her smile as gentle as ever. But as he walked away, she noted the spring in his step, as if he believed he had navigated their conversation unscathed. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of their talk. Victor's composure was a shield, she suspected, and behind it lay a motive rooted in pride and rivalry. She left the yacht club, the evening air cool against her face, and paused to gaze at the harbour. The wind chaser gleamed under the fading light, its lines sleek and predatory. Miss Marple thought of Edward Lyle, found far from his yacht, his neck marked by a struggle. Victor's ambition, she reasoned, could have driven him to desperate measures, especially if Edward had posed a threat to his victory. In St. Mary Mead, she had once seen a man ruin another over a village cricket match. Here, with a silver cup and a reputation at stake, the stakes were higher still. She resolved to speak next with Clara Henshaw, whose intense watchfulness and trembling hands suggested a deeper connection to the tragedy. As Miss Marple walked back to Raymond's cottage, the harbour lights twinkling like stars, her mind turned over Victor's words, his pauses, his guarded glances. The truth, she knew, was like a sail catching the wind. Elusive, but with the right angle, it could be caught. And in Lymouth, she was determined to find that angle. Chapter 7. The Spectator's Obsession. The evening draped Lymouth in a soft veil of twilight, the harbour lights flickering like fireflies against the darkening sea. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a constant companion, walked slowly along the quay, her eyes searching for Clara Henshaw. The woman's solitary intensity at the Regatta, her binoculars fixed on the sea sprite, had stirred Miss Marple's curiosity, much like a faint snag in a skein of wool. Clara's trembling hands and evasive answers at the Lymouth Inn suggested she held a piece of the puzzle surrounding Edward Lyle's death, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. She found Clara at the far end of the harbour, standing alone on a weathered bench, her navy shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The binoculars hung from a strap around her neck, their lenses catching the last glimmers of daylight. Clara's gaze was fixed on the water, where the sea sprite and wind chaser lay at anchor, their silhouettes stark against the horizon. Miss Marple approached with her usual quiet grace, her footsteps barely audible on the damp stones. "Good evening, Miss Henshaw," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "It's a fine view, isn't it?" "The sea has a way of drawing one's thoughts," Clara started, her hand flying to the binoculars as if to shield them. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin and unsteady. "I didn't see you there." Her eyes, shadowed and wary, darted to the side, and Miss Marple noted the tightness in her posture, like a bird poised to flee. With a reassuring smile, Miss Marple settled onto the bench, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click. "I often find a quiet moment by the water helps clear the mind," she said, her tone inviting confidence. "You were so absorbed during the race, I couldn't help but notice." A keen interest in sailing, perhaps? Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "Not sailing exactly," she murmured. "I was watching for someone." Her words were reluctant, as if pried loose by Miss Marple's gentle persistence. The older woman nodded, her needles moving steadily, and she ventured a guess, drawing on her observations at the inn. "For Mr. Lyle, perhaps? I understand you knew him." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise, and Miss Marple's mind registered the hit, much as she noted a perfect stitch. "How did you—" Clara began, then stopped, her lips pressing into a thin line. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but her eyes were sharp behind her spectacles. "A little bird told me you might be related," she said, her voice soft but probing. "A cousin, perhaps?" "It's only natural to watch out for family, especially in such a grand event." Clara's shoulders slumped, and after a moment she nodded. "Edward was my cousin, distant, but we were close once, as children. I hadn't seen him in years until he came to Lymouth. I wanted to see him win. That's all." Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind turning over Clara's words. The woman's intensity during the race, her powerful binoculars, suggested more than familial pride. "You must have been proud," she said, "watching him on the Sea Sprite. Those binoculars of yours, they must give a splendid view." Clara's hand tightened on the strap, and she nodded curtly. "They're good for detail." I could see Edward at the bow, working the jib. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple caught the tremor, a sign of something unspoken. "Did you see anything else?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as light as if discussing the weather. "The race was so exciting, but that rocky outcrop, it's a curious spot, isn't it?" So far from the course, Clara's face paled, and her eyes flicked to the sea, where the outcrop's shadow loomed in the distance. "I didn't notice it," she said quickly, too quickly. "I was focused on Edward, not the scenery." The lie was subtle, but to Miss Marple it was as clear as a dropped stitch in a scarf. Clara's binoculars, capable of picking out a gull's feathers at 100 yards, would have seen more than she admitted. Miss Marple shifted tack, her voice warm with sympathy. "It must have been dreadful, hearing of his loss. Did you see him fall?" Clara shook her head, her fingers now twisting the shawl into knots. "No, I looked away for a moment. Someone in the crowd bumped me. When I looked back, he was gone." Her words were halting, and Miss Marple noted the inconsistency. At the inn, Clara had claimed to see nothing unusual, yet now she spoke of a distraction. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once unravelled a theft by catching such small contradictions. And here she sensed Clara was holding back a vital truth. The conversation turned to Edward himself, Miss Marple asking about his life in Lymouth. Clara's answers were sparse but revealing. He was quiet, kept to himself. Loved sailing, though. He wrote to me once, said the sea sprite was his home." Her voice softened, but her eyes remained guarded, as if guarding a memory she dared not share. Miss Marple probed gently, asking if Edward had enemies. "Not that I know," Clara said, but her hesitation suggested otherwise. "He got on with the crew, I think. Though he mentioned the captain, Hargrove, could be hard. And that other sailor, Victor Crane, he didn't like." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment. "Didn't like Mr. Crane. How interesting. Did he say why?" Clara shook her head, her lips tight. "Just that Victor was too full of himself. Edward didn't trust him." The words were a thread, thin but strong, and Miss Marple tucked them away. Victor's ambition, Clara's watchfulness, Edward's distrust, each was a piece of the pattern forming in her mind. As the twilight deepened, Miss Marple rose, thanking Clara for her time. "You've been most kind," she said, her smile warm, but her eyes searching. "I do hope you'll find some peace, my dear." Clara nodded, her expression a mix of relief and unease, and Miss Marple noted the way she clutched her binoculars as she turned back to the sea. Walking back to Raymond's cottage, the harbour now cloaked in shadow, Miss Marple's thoughts were alive with possibilities. Clara's connection to Edward, her intense observation, and her evasive answers suggested she had seen something during the race, something she feared to reveal. The rocky outcrop, once again, loomed in her mind. Clara's binoculars could have captured details the naked eye missed, perhaps a movement, a struggle, near that isolated spur of rock. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once solved a mystery by noting a woman's reluctance to admit what she'd seen through a window. Here, Clara's binoculars were a similar lens, focused on a truth she could not yet voice. Was she protecting someone, or herself? And why had Edward distrusted Victor Crane? Miss Marple tightened her grip on her knitting bag, her needles itching to resume their work. The next step, she decided, was to examine the rocky outcrop itself, perhaps at low tide when its secrets might be laid bare. This truth, she knew, was like a tide pool, hidden beneath the surface, but with patience, its treasures could be found. In Lymouth, as in St. Mary Mead, she would find them, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 8. The Clue in the Tide. The dawn broke over Lymouth with a crisp clarity, the sky a pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud, and the tide retreating to reveal the jagged edges of the rocky outcrop in St. Mary's Bay. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, set out with Raymond West to investigate this lonely spur of rock that had lingered in her thoughts since the Regatta's tragic end. Her sensible shoes crunched on the shingle as they descended to the shore, her knitting bag slung over her arm, its weight a comforting constant. The air was sharp with salt, and the gulls wheeled overhead, their cries a mournful echo of the sea's unrest. Raymond, bundled in a scarf against the morning chill, glanced at his aunt with a mix of amusement and curiosity. "Aunt Jane, you're not planning to climb those rocks, are you?" They looked treacherous. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "My dear Raymond, one need not climb to see what lies in plain sight. The tide often reveals what the waves conceal." Her tone was light, but her mind was focused, turning over the threads of the mystery. Hargrove's dispute, Tommy's secret, Victor's ambition, and Clara's guarded watchfulness. The outcrop, she suspected, held a clue to Edward Lyle's death, a piece of the pattern yet to be woven. They reached the base of the outcrop, where the receding tide had left pools of seawater glinting among the rocks. Seaweed clung in dark, slippery strands, and small crabs scuttled into crevices. Miss Marple moved carefully, her gaze sweeping the ground with the precision of a seamstress inspecting her work. Raymond followed, his skepticism giving way to interest as she paused to examine a cluster of seaweed. "What are you looking for, Aunt Jane?" he asked, crouching beside her. "Something out of place," she replied, her voice soft but intent. Her fingers, deft despite their age, parted the seaweed to reveal a scrap of sailcloth, its edges frayed but its weave distinct. It was no larger than a handkerchief, but its pale blue colour and a faint embroidered emblem, a stylized wave, caught her eye. "How curious," she murmured, lifting it carefully with a gloved hand. "This isn't from the Sea Sprite." Their sails are plain white. Raymond peered at it, his brow furrowing. Could it be from another yacht? The Wind Chaser, perhaps? Miss Marple tucked the sailcloth into her bag, her mind already connecting it to Victor Crane's sleek vessel. "Perhaps," she said, her tone non-committal, but her thoughts racing. The Wind Chaser's sails, she recalled from her visit to the yacht club, bore a similar emblem, a mark of pride for its ambitious captain. The outcrop's isolation, far from the race's main course, suggested this scrap had not drifted there by chance. Had it torn during a struggle, perhaps as Edward Lisle was pushed into the sea? The marks on his neck noted by Doctor Haydock pointed to violence, and this cloth was a tangible link to that moment. She continued her search, her eyes scanning the rocks for further traces. Near a shallow pool, she spotted a glint of metal. A small buckle, rusted but intact, half buried in the sand. It was the kind used on a sailor's belt, unremarkable, yet significant in its context. "Edward wore a belt, I presume?" she asked Raymond, who nodded, recalling the sodden clothes on the body brought ashore. Miss Marple left the buckle where it lay, noting its position for the inspector, but her mind filed it alongside the sailcloth. 2 clues, small but telling, in a place where Edward should not have been. As they walked back to the village, the tide beginning to creep in once more, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the sea's currents. She had borrowed a tide chart from Raymond's cottage, and now she consulted it, her finger tracing the lines of flow. The chart showed a strong current sweeping from the outcrop toward the spot where Edward's body had been found, far from the Sea Sprite's path. "The current carried him," she said, half to herself. "Whoever did this knew the tide would hide the time and place of his death." Raymond, catching her drift, frowned. "You think someone planned it that way? To make it look like an accident?" Miss Marple's needles, now in hand, clicked softly as she walked. "I think, my dear, that murder is rarely impulsive. The outcrop is too far from the course for Edward to have drifted there by chance. Someone ensured he was there, and the tide was their ally." Her mind returned to St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's body had been found in a stream, moved by water to obscure the crime's origin. Here, the sea played a similar role, but the sailcloth and buckle were threads that refused to be swept away. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple spread the sailcloth on the table, its emblem clear in the morning light. Raymond, fetching a magnifying glass, confirmed its likeness to the Wind Chaser's markings. "Victor Crane's yacht," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "This could be evidence, Aunt Jane." She nodded, but her expression remained cautious. "It could, Raymond, but we must be sure. A scrap of cloth is not a confession." Yet, inwardly, she felt the pattern tightening. Victor's ambition, his yacht's proximity to the sea sprite, and now this sailcloth. Each pointed to a man who might have seen Edward as an obstacle to victory. She resolved to share her findings with Inspector Crane, though she knew his methodical approach might overlook the subtleties of human motive. The buckle, too, warranted investigation. Had it been Edward's or another's? And Clara Henshaw's binoculars, capable of piercing the distance to the outcrop, nagged at her. Had Clara seen something she feared to admit? In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once solved a theft by noting a maid's hesitation over a missing brooch. Here, the sailcloth and buckle were similar tokens, small but heavy with meaning. As Raymond prepared tea, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The harbour lay quiet below, but her mind was anything but. The outcrop, the current, the sailcloth, all were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a deliberate act. Victor Crane's ambition loomed large, but she could not yet dismiss Hargrove's tension, Tommy's guilt, or Clara's secrecy. The truth, she knew, was like a tide, relentless, revealing, and waiting to be charted. In Lymouth, as in St. Mary Mead, she would navigate its currents with care. Chapter 9. The motive takes shape. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated the parlour of Raymond West's cottage, where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, meditative rhythm. Outside, the Lymouth night was still, the harbour a mirror of stars broken only by the occasional ripple of the tide. The sailcloth and buckle from the rocky outcrop lay on the table before her, their presence a quiet challenge to the mystery of Edward Lyall's death. Raymond, nursing a cup of cocoa, watched his aunt with growing fascination. "You're piecing it together, aren't you, Aunt Jane?" he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "That sailcloth, it's from the Windchaser, isn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but her reply was cautious. "It appears so, Raymond, but appearances can be deceptive. We must weave the threads carefully." Her mind, however, was far from idle, turning over the fragments of evidence and conversation she had gathered. Hargrove's gruff certainty, Tommy's nervous confession, Victor's polished ambition, Clara's guarded watchfulness, and now the sailcloth with its telltale emblem. Each was a stitch in a pattern that was beginning to take shape, though its full design remained elusive. She began by revisiting Hargrove's account. The captain's insistence that Edward was too skilled to fall, coupled with their dispute over prize money, suggested tension aboard the Sea Sprite. Yet Hargrove's alibi was solid. He had been at the helm, visible to Tommy and the other crews during the race's critical moments. A captain, Miss Marple reasoned, would not risk his reputation or his yacht's victory by leaving his post. Still, his defensiveness when questioned about Edward's demands hinted at pride. A motive she had seen drive men to rash acts in St. Mary Mead. Could Hargrove have acted in a moment of anger, perhaps during a private confrontation? The idea lingered, but the sailcloth pointed elsewhere. Tommy Blake's secret about the rum was more troubling. His fear of Edward's threat to expose him gave him a motive, however small, and his strong hands could have managed a struggle. Yet his panic at the inn and aboard the Sea Sprite seemed born of guilt rather than malice. Miss Marple recalled a young man in her village who had stolen apples from an orchard, his terror at being caught far outweighing the crime. Tommy's nervousness felt similar, genuine, but not necessarily murderous. The scuff on the deck, though, nagged at her. Had it been made in a struggle, or was it, as Tommy claimed, merely a dropped tool? She made a mental note to ask Inspector Crane to examine it. Victor Crane, with his sleek yacht and sharper ambition, loomed largest in her thoughts. The sailcloth, bearing the Windchaser's emblem, placed his yacht, or something from it, near the rocky outcrop where Edward had likely met his end. Victor's frustration at losing to Hargrove 3 years running, coupled with his reported boast of taking care of his competition, suggested a man who saw victory as a necessity, not a hope. Miss Marple thought of a saint, Mary Mead Grocer, who had sabotaged a rival's delivery to secure a contract. Victor's ambition, she suspected, ran deeper, perhaps deep enough to eliminate an obstacle like Edward. Had Edward known something about Victor's plans? Perhaps a scheme to sabotage the Sea Sprite? The Windchaser's proximity to the Sea Sprite during the race, a detail the police had overlooked, supported this theory. A skilled sailor like Victor could have manoeuvred close, perhaps under cover of a gust, to act unseen. Clara Henshaw's role was less clear, but no less compelling. Her binoculars, her familial tie to Edward, and her evasive answers suggested she had seen something during the race, something she feared to reveal. Miss Marple pondered Clara's claim of being distracted by the crowd, contradicted by her earlier insistence at the inn that she saw nothing unusual. In St. Mary Mead, a spinster's hesitation over a neighbour's affair had unravelled a blackmail scheme. Here, Clara's reluctance hinted at a similar burden. Had she witnessed a struggle near the outcrop, perhaps involving Victor's yacht? Her distrust of Victor, mentioned in passing, added weight to this possibility. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the tide chart, which she had studied again that evening. The current's path from the outcrop to where Edward's body was found suggested a deliberate act, timed to let the sea obscure the crime's origin. The buckle, possibly Edward's, and the sailcloth, likely Victor's, pointed to a moment of violence at the outcrop, a moment someone had planned to hide. Victor's ambition, she concluded, was the strongest thread, but she could not yet rule out Hargrove's pride, Tommy's fear, or Clara's silence. Raymond, watching her, broke the silence. "You're awfully quiet, Aunt Jane. Have you got it all worked out?" She smiled, her expression serene, but her mind alight. "Not quite, my dear. It's like knitting a complicated pattern. One must see the whole before the pieces make sense. But I think Mr. Crane's ambition may have outrun his judgment." She rose, tucking her knitting away, and suggested they attend the yacht club's gathering that evening, where the suspects were likely to be present. "People reveal themselves in company," she said, "and we may yet find another stitch to pull." At the yacht club the atmosphere was subdued, the Regatta's tragedy casting a pall over the usual chatter. Hargrove stood by the bar, his face grim as he spoke to a local sailor. Tommy lingered near the door, his eyes darting nervously. Victor held court at a table, his charm undimmed, though Miss Marple noted a new tension in his posture. Clara sat alone, her binoculars absent but her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple, settling into a corner with Raymond, observed them all, her mind weaving their motives into a tapestry. She leaned toward Raymond, her voice low. "Watch Mr. Crane, my dear. He speaks easily, but his eyes are wary. And Miss Henshaw, she's hiding something, I'm sure of it." Raymond nodded, his curiosity piqued. "You think Victor did it, don't you?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I think, Raymond, that ambition can be a dangerous wind. It fills a sail but can capsize a man." She resolved to speak with Inspector Crane tomorrow, to share the sailcloth and buckle, and to suggest a closer look at the wind chaser's movements. The truth, she knew, was like a tide, inevitable, waiting to be charted. In Lymouth, as in St. Mary Mead, she would follow its currents to their source. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The Lymouth Yacht Club, bathed in the warm glow of its brass lanterns, hummed with a strained conviviality as the village gathered for an impromptu memorial for Edward Lisle. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and sea salt, and the murmur of voices rose and fell like the tide outside. Miss Jane Marple, seated near a window with a view of the darkened harbour, observed the room with her usual quiet intensity, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. Raymond West, at her side, sipped a glass of sherry, his eyes following hers to the key figures in the room: Captain Richard Hargrove, Tommy Blake, Victor Crane, and Clara Henshaw, all present under the guise of paying respects. Miss Marple had arranged, through a discreet word to Raymond's friend, the magistrate Mr. Pethwick, for Inspector Crane to attend with a specific purpose. She had shared her findings, the sailcloth with the Windchaser's emblem, and the buckle from the rocky outcrop, with the inspector that morning, urging him to consider a reenactment of the race's critical moment. "The sea keeps its secrets, Inspector," she had said, her voice gentle but firm. "But the truth has a way of catching the light." Now, as the club filled with villagers and sailors, she sensed the moment was ripe to test her suspicions. Inspector Crane, his moustache bristling with authority, called for attention, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're here to honour Edward Lisle, but also to seek answers. With your cooperation, we'll recreate a portion of the regatta's course to clarify the events of that day." The room fell silent, eyes turning to the suspects. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Tommy shifted uneasily. Victor's smile was a shade too smooth, and Clara's hands clutched her handbag with a tremor. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharp as she watched their reactions. The reenactment was set for the harbour, where the Sea Sprite and Windchaser were positioned as they had been during the race's fateful leg. The crowd gathered on the quay, their faces lit by torches, the yachts ghostly in the moonlight. Miss Marple, standing with Raymond near the water's edge, pointed to the rocky outcrop, its silhouette stark against the sea. "There, Inspector," she said softly, "is where Edward Lisle met his end. Not by accident, but by design." Her voice carried a quiet conviction, and Inspector Crane, though initially sceptical, nodded, directing his men to guide the yachts into position. As the Sea Sprite took its place, Hargrove at the helm, Miss Marple addressed the crowd, her tone as mild as if discussing a parish tea. Edward Lisle was a skilled sailor, unlikely to fall, yet his body was found far from the Sea Sprite's course, near the outcrop, with marks of a struggle on his neck. She held up the sailcloth, its Windchaser emblem catching the torchlight. "This was found at the outcrop, torn, as if caught in a moment of violence. And the Windchaser, we know, was close to the Sea Sprite at that time." Victor Crane, standing on the Windchaser's deck, laughed, a sound sharp and dismissive. "That's absurd, Miss Marple. A bit of cloth proves nothing." The Windchaser was trailing, focused on the race. I saw no fall, no struggle." His voice was confident, but Miss Marple noted the slight clench of his fist, a crack in his polished facade. She continued undeterred, her eyes meeting his. "You are a strong swimmer, mister." "Crane, are you not? Skilled enough to slip from your yacht to the sea sprite, perhaps under cover of a gust, and return unnoticed. The current carried Edward's body away, as you knew it would," the crowd murmured, and Hargrove's face darkened. "You're saying someone boarded my ship," he growled. Tommy, pale and silent, stared at the deck, while Clara's eyes widened, her handbag slipping to the ground. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice calm but relentless. "Edward knew something, didn't he, Mr. Crane? Something that threatened your victory. Perhaps a plan to tamper with the Sea Sprite's rigging. He was at the bow, alone, checking the jib. A perfect moment to silence him." Victor's composure faltered, his eyes narrowing. "This is nonsense," he snapped, but his voice carried a tremor. Miss Marple produced the buckle, holding it aloft. "This, too, was found at the outcrop. It matches the belt Edward wore. A struggle, mister. Crane left traces you could not erase." She turned to Clara, her gaze gentle but piercing. "Miss Henshaw, your binoculars saw more than you've admitted. Did you see the wind chaser draw close to the Sea Sprite? Did you see a struggle?" Clara's face crumpled, her hands shaking. I didn't want to believe it," she whispered. "I saw movement near the outcrop, a figure on the Sea Sprite's bow. It wasn't clear, but the wind chaser was so close." Her voice broke, and the crowd gasped. Victor's face strained of colour, his charm replaced by a desperate edge. "She's lying," he shouted. "She's grieving seeing things." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a steady counterpoint to the rising tension. "The sea and the truth, Mr. de Crane, have a way of revealing what's hidden. You acted to protect your reputation, didn't you?" Her words, soft but unyielding, hung in the air, and Victor's defiance seemed to waver, caught in the tide of her logic. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once unmasked a liar, by pressing gently on their contradictions. Here, the sailcloth, the buckle, and Clara's reluctant testimony were her tools. The truth was close, she sensed, like a sail catching the wind, ready to unfurl. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his eyes on Victor, ready to act on the unfolding revelation. Chapter 11. The Confession. The torchlight flickered across the Lymouth quay, casting long shadows that danced like spectres on the water. The crowd, gathered for the reenactment of the regatta's fateful moment, stood hushed, their eyes fixed on Victor Crane as he faced Miss Jane Marple's calm, unyielding accusations. The Sea Sprite and Wind Chaser bobbed gently in the harbour, their decks silent witnesses to the drama unfolding. Miss Marple, a small figure framed by the torch glow, held the sailcloth aloft, its Wind Chaser emblem a stark accusation in the night. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, but her needles were still, her attention wholly on Victor, whose polished facade was crumbling like sand before the tide. Inspector Crane, his moustache bristling with purpose, stepped closer to Victor, his notebook poised. "Mr. Crane," he said, his voice sharp, "Miss Marple's evidence is compelling. The sailcloth, the buckle, Miss Henshaw's testimony. Can you explain them?" The crowd leaned in, their breaths held, as Victor's eyes darted from the inspector to Miss Marple, then to Clara Henshaw, whose tear-streaked face betrayed her anguish. Tommy Blake, standing near the Sea Sprite, clutched the railing, his knuckles white, while Captain Hargrove's grim expression held a mix of shock and dawning realization. Victor's laugh, sharp and brittle, cut through the silence. "This is preposterous," he said, his voice straining to maintain its usual confidence. "A scrap of cloth, a buckle, a grieving woman's imagination. What proof is that?" But his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow despite the cool night air. She tilted her head, her voice as gentle as a lullaby, but as piercing as a needle. "Mr. Crane, you are a man of ambition, and ambition can blind one to consequences. Edward Lyle knew something, didn't he? Something that could have cost you the race and your reputation." Victor's eyes flashed, and for a moment he seemed poised to deny it again. But Miss Marple pressed on, her tone unwavering. "The wind chaser was close to the sea sprite, near the rocky outcrop. You swam to Edward, perhaps to confront him, and in a moment of desperation, you ensured he would not speak. The sailcloth tore in the struggle, and the current, as you calculated, carried him away." She gestured to Clara, her eyes soft but insistent. Miss Henshaw saw enough to suspect, though she feared to speak. "But the truth, Mr. Crane, is like the sea. It cannot be held back forever." Clara, trembling, stepped forward, her voice breaking. "I saw it," she whispered, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. "I saw a figure on the sea sprite's bow, struggling with Edward. The wind chaser was so close, closer than it should have been. I didn't want to believe it was murder, but I knew." Her voice faltered, and she covered her face, tears streaming. The crowd gasped, and Victor's composure shattered. "You're mad!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I was on my yacht steering. Ask my crew." But his crew, two young men standing at the windchaser's rail, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes avoiding his. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to them, noting their hesitation, and she spoke again, her voice a quiet anchor in the storm. "Your crew, Mr. Crane, may have been too busy with their tasks to notice a brief absence. You are a strong swimmer, as you told me yourself. A quick dive, a moment's work, and back to your helm before anyone knew." She held up the buckle, its rust catching the light. "This, found with the sailcloth, was Edward's. You didn't expect it to stay at the outcrop, did you?" Victor's face drained of colour, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the evidence bore down. "He was going to ruin me," he burst out, his voice raw with desperation. "Edward found out. I'd planned to loosen the sea sprite's rigging, just enough to slow them. He threatened to tell Hargrove, to get me disqualified. I couldn't let him destroy everything I'd worked for." The confession hung in the air, a stark admission that silenced the crowd. Inspector Crane signalled to his constables, who moved toward Victor, their faces grim. Hargrove stepped forward, his voice rough with anger. "You killed my man for a cup," he growled. His fists clenched. Tommy, tears in his eyes, spoke up, his voice shaky. "I thought it was my fault, ma'am," he said to Miss Marple. "Edward caught me with that rum, and I was scared he'd told someone. But I didn't hurt him, I swear." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. "I know, Tommy. Your secret was small, but it weighed heavily. You're free of it now." Clara, still trembling, approached Miss Marple, her voice barely audible. "I should have spoken sooner. I was afraid of what it meant." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch as gentle as her words. "Fear can cloud the truth, my dear, but you've helped bring it to light." The crowd murmured, some in shock, others in relief, as Victor was led away, his head bowed, his ambition reduced to ashes. Inspector Crane turned to Miss Marple, his stern face softened by respect. "You've a sharp mind, ma'am. We'd have missed that sailcloth without you." She smiled, her needles resuming their soft clicking. "I only saw what was there, Inspector." People, like the sea, reveal their secrets if you watch closely. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unmasked a murderer by noting a misplaced hairpin. Here, the sailcloth and buckle had served the same purpose, small clues that unravelled a larger crime. As the crowd dispersed, the yacht silent in the harbour, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth had surfaced, as she knew it would, carried by the tide of human nature. Victor's ambition had driven him to murder, but the sea and Clara's reluctant testimony had betrayed him. The mystery of Edward Lyle's death was solved, but the Regatta's silver cup would remain unclaimed, a sombre reminder of its cost. Chapter 12. The Regatta's End. The morning after Victor Crane's confession dawned soft and clear over Lymouth. The harbour bathed in a light that seemed to cleanse the shadows of the previous night. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlour of Raymond West's cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The silver cup, meant to crown the Regatta's victor, remained unclaimed, locked away in the yacht club's cabinet, its gleam dimmed by the tragedy of Edward Lyle's death. Outside, the village stirred slowly, its rhythm subdued as whispers of the night's events spread from cottage to quay. Raymond, pouring tea from a chipped pot, looked at his aunt with a mix of awe and curiosity. "You've done it again, Aunt Jane," he said, setting a cup before her. "Unravelled a murder as neatly as one of your scarves." "How do you always see what others miss?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but her smile was modest. "People, Raymond, are predictable in their unpredictability. Like wool, they unravel when you find the right thread to pull. In this case, ambition was the loosest strand." She sipped her tea, her mind retracing the pattern of the mystery. Captain Hargrove's pride, Tommy Blake's guilt, Clara Henshaw's fear, and Victor Crane's ruthless ambition, each had played a part. But it was Victor's desperation to secure the silver cup that had led him to drown Edward near the rocky outcrop. The sailcloth, torn in the struggle, and the buckle, left behind by chance, had been the clues that guided her, much as a misplaced letter had once revealed a blackmailer in St. Mary Mead. Clara's reluctant testimony, drawn out by gentle persistence, had sealed the truth, and the tide's current had done the rest, betraying Victor's attempt to hide his crime. The village, she knew, would talk of the Regatta for years, not for its glory, but for its grim end. Hargrove had vowed to dedicate his next race to Edward's memory, a gesture Miss Marple found fitting, if sombre. Tommy, cleared of suspicion, had returned to the sea sprite with a lighter heart, his secret about the rum no longer a burden. Clara, still shaken, had confided to Miss Marple that morning that she planned to leave Lymouth, seeking peace away from the sea's haunting whispers. As for Victor, he awaited trial, his charm and ambition reduced to a cautionary tale among the sailors. Miss Marple felt no triumph in his downfall, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. "It's a sad thing," she said to Raymond, her needles clicking softly, "when a man's pride leads him to such lengths. But the sea, like truth, has a way of bringing things to light." Raymond leaned forward, his eyes bright. "You saw it all from the start, didn't you? The sailcloth, the outcrop. How did you know?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, her fingers never faltering. "I didn't know, my dear. I only watched and listened. People reveal themselves in small ways. A glance, a hesitation, a scrap of cloth caught on a rock. In Lymouth, as in St. Mary Mead, it's the small things that tell the story." She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and suggested a walk to the harbour before her return to St. Mary Mead. The quay was quiet, the yachts at rest, their sails furled like memories of the race. Miss Marple paused by the water's edge, her gaze on the rocky outcrop, now softened by the morning light. The sea was calm, its secrets laid bare, and she felt a peace settle over her, as steady as the rhythm of her needles. As they turned back to the cottage, Raymond chuckled. "Lymouth won't forget you, Aunt Jane." "You've given them a tale to rival any regatta." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Let them talk, Raymond. Stories like the tide come and go, but truth, once found, stays fast with that." She walked on, her small figure a beacon of quiet resolve, ready to return to the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, where other threads, other truths awaited her deft touch,